The words fell out of Bernard Walker's mouth like stones dropped into a dry well, each one landing heavy and final, and Alberta Prescott sat across the supper table with her fork suspended halfway between her plate and her lips, utterly still, the way a person goes still when the ground beneath them has just shifted, and they are not yet certain whether it will hold. "I buried my son in that pasture," Bernard said. His voice was flat, scraped clean of everything except the truth, and that truth hit the warm kitchen air like a cold wind under a door. 5 years ago, in the spring, and I have not opened that gate since. Alberta set her fork down. The oil lamp between them threw gold light across his face, and she could see now what she had not been able to name before, the particular architecture of grief that a man builds around himself when he has been carrying something alone for too long. She had wondered about the East Pasture since the day she arrived at the Walker Ranch 3 weeks ago. She had noticed the padlocked gate, the grass grown tall and undisturbed behind it, the way Bernard's jaw tightened whenever her gaze drifted in that direction. She had filed it away as one of the many secrets this man kept, and she had told herself that secrets were his right, that she was a stranger here, that she had no claim on his hidden places. But tonight at supper she had asked, and he had told her everything. It would take her weeks to understand the full weight of what he gave her in that moment, not just the story, but the act of telling it. She had not been supposed to end up here at all. Alberta Prescott had grown up in Cincinnati, Ohio, in a tall, narrow house that smelled of camphor and disappointment. Her father had been a clockmaker, precise and cold, a man who believed that sentiment was a form of weakness, and that women who displayed it publicly were an embarrassment to their families. Her mother had died of typhoid when Alberta was 11, and after that the house had grown quieter and her father had grown harder, and Alberta had learned to keep her feelings banked low and controlled, the way you keep a fire when you are not certain how much would you have left. She had worked as a school teacher after she turned 22. She had been good at it, genuinely good, the kind of teacher children remembered long after they had grown. She had a gift for explaining difficult things simply, and she had a patience with people who were struggling that she had never quite been able to apply to herself. She had been 26 when the school board in Cincinnati had let her go, not because of any failing on her part, but because one of the board members' wives had decided that a school teacher without a husband was a moral hazard to impressionable young minds, which was the kind of reasoning that passed for wisdom among certain people in 1882. The year mattered. It was 1882, and the world was moving, and Alberta Prescott had found herself with a small savings, a trunk of books, and no particular place she was required to be. She had answered the advertisement in the Cincinnati Enquirer on a Tuesday afternoon in February while sitting in her boarding house room with the radiator clanking and the snow pressing gray against the window. The advertisement had read, "Rancher in Crockett County, Texas seeks capable housekeeper, age 25-40, willing to relocate. References required. Wages fair. Apply in writing to be Walker, Sweetwater Creek, Texas." It had been one of several advertisements she studied that afternoon. She had answered 3 of them. Bernard Walker had been the only one to write back. His letter had been brief and factual. He ran a cattle operation, roughly 4,000 acres in the hill country south of the town of Sweetwater Creek. He needed someone to manage the household, to cook, to maintain the accounts, and to handle correspondence, as his handwriting was, by his own admission, barely legible. He offered $20 a month, room and board included. He mentioned that he was a widower. He did not mention anything else. Alberta had written back. She had been honest in her letter about her experience, her temperament, and her expectations. She had said she was not afraid of hard work or remote locations, that she had never cooked for more than 4 people but was willing to learn, and that she expected to be treated with common decency. She had added that last part deliberately, because experience had taught her that the people who needed to be told about common decency were precisely the ones she needed to assess before committing herself to anything. Bernard had written back a second time. His letter was longer this time, and she could tell he had labored over it. The handwriting was uneven, the sentences occasionally trailing into near illegibility before recovering themselves. He said he agreed with her on all points. He said she should know that the ranch was isolated and that the nearest town was a 2-hour ride on a good horse. He said that his 2 ranch hands, Clem and Dorado, lived in the bunkhouse, and she would have the main house largely to herself when he was working the range. He said that he had a dog named Patch who would be suspicious of her at first but would come around. He did not use a single unnecessary word. Alberta had accepted the position and arrived by train to San Angelo in late March of 1882, and then by hired wagon another 30 miles south to Sweetwater Creek, and then by Bernard's own buckboard wagon another 12 miles out to the ranch itself. A journey she had made alone with a man she had never met, both of them observing a careful and mutual silence that she had found oddly respectful rather than uncomfortable. Bernard Walker was not what she had pictured. She had pictured someone older, more worn down, the kind of man who advertised for a housekeeper because he had given up on finding anything else. Bernard was 34 years old, which she learned later. He was tall and lean with the kind of body that comes from years of physical labor, broad through the shoulders and tapered at the hip, and he had dark hair going gray at the temples and eyes that were an unusual shade of amber that she noticed immediately, and then immediately pretended not to have noticed. He had a strong jaw and a seriousness about his face that might have read as coldness until you saw the way he spoke to his horse, which was quietly, and with what appeared to be genuine courtesy. He had carried her trunk up to the room she would be using without being asked to. He had shown her the kitchen, the root cellar, the smokehouse, where the well was, and where the outhouse was. He had shown her the accounts ledger and apologized for its state, which was genuinely chaotic. He had introduced her to Clem and Dorado, who were polite in the way that men are polite when they are slightly uncertain about a new situation. He had introduced her to Patch, a brown and white dog of ambiguous breed who had sniffed her hand and then sat on her foot, which she took as a positive sign. Then Bernard had excused himself to see to something in the barn, and Alberta had stood alone in the kitchen of the Walker Ranch and looked around at the space she would need to make her own, and she had felt, for the first time in a very long while, something that was not quite hope but was pointed in that direction. The first week had been about learning the rhythms of the place. Alberta was not a woman who needed to be told something twice. She absorbed information quickly and systematically, cataloging what the household needed, what it had, and what she would need to acquire on the next supply run to town. The kitchen was workable but had been managed with the kind of bachelor pragmatism that meant every meal had been functional but nothing more. She changed that starting with the very first supper she cooked, a proper beef stew with biscuits made from scratch, because she had found a bag of flour and a can of lard, and had decided that a good meal was the fastest way to establish that she intended to take her work seriously. Bernard had eaten without comment, which she initially read as disapproval until she noticed that he had eaten 3 helpings, which was its own kind of compliment. The accounts ledger was a genuine disaster, not because Bernard was careless with money. He was anything but because he was a man who kept everything in his head and wrote down only what he absolutely had to, in handwriting that only he could fully decipher. Alberta had spent 3 full days reorganizing it, creating a proper system with columns and dated entries, and when she showed it to Bernard, he had looked at it for a long moment and then said, "That's considerably better," which, she was learning, was the Walker equivalent of effusive praise. She had been at the ranch 9 days when she first saw the east pasture clearly. She had been hanging washing on the line behind the house, and she had turned to straighten the sheets, and there it was, perhaps 200 yards to the east, a long wooden fence line in good repair with a gate at the near end, secured with a heavy iron padlock. Beyond the fence, grass grew tall and undisturbed, a different shade of green from the rest of the pasture land, somehow more vivid, as if it had been left entirely alone for long enough that the land had reclaimed it completely. It was a substantial piece of land. She estimated perhaps 40 acres, which was not a small thing to leave idle on a working cattle ranch. Clem, who was 52 and had worked for Bernard for 11 years, came around the corner of the barn just then, and Alberta had asked him, keeping her voice carefully casual, whether the east pasture was normally kept this way. Clem had stopped walking. Something had moved across his face, not quite grief, but something adjacent to it, the way a shadow moves when a cloud passes over the sun. "That's the boss's business," Clem had said, not unkindly, and then he had continued to where he was going. She had not asked again, not then. But she had noticed the way Bernard always paused when he was riding the fence line of the ranch. She had seen it twice from the kitchen window, and stopped at the corner post nearest the east pasture gate, just stood there for a moment looking in, and then turned his horse and rode on as if he had not paused at all. The days settled into something that was not yet comfort but was beginning to move toward it. Alberta established routines quickly, because routines gave her purchase on unfamiliar ground. She was up before Bernard most mornings, which required effort since Bernard rose with the sun, and had coffee on the stove and something substantial on the table by the time he came in from his first round of morning chores. She had discovered that he liked his coffee strong enough to support a spoon standing upright in it, and that he preferred his eggs fried with the yolks broken, and she provided both without discussion, because the best way to tell a person you were paying attention was to show them rather than announce it. Bernard noticed. She could tell by the way his manner with her shifted, gradually and incrementally, like a door being opened very slowly by someone who was not entirely sure they wanted to open it. He began stopping in the kitchen in the evening sometimes, not always. There were evenings he went straight to his room after supper, and she did not take that personally, but sometimes he would sit at the kitchen table with his coffee and look at the accounts she was working on, or ask about what she had needed from town that she had added to the supply list, or simply sit in the presence of another person without any particular agenda, which was its own form of trust. She learned things about him in fragments, the way you learn about a landscape by moving through it over time. He had grown up in this part of Texas. His father had built the original ranch house, which Bernard had extended after he took over the operation at 22 when his father died. He had married at 25 a woman named Ruth from a neighboring ranching family, whose portrait hung in the hallway between the kitchen and the sitting room. Alberta had looked at the portrait with honest attention on her first night. Ruth Walker had been a pretty woman, dark-eyed and dark-haired, with a serene quality about her expression that spoke of a particular kind of goodness. Alberta had felt no jealousy of the dead woman, only a complicated and honest recognition of what Bernard must have had and what he must have lost. Ruth had died in childbirth. Alberta pieced this together from the absence of the child as much as from anything that was said directly. There had been a child, that much was clear. There were small things in the house that told the story in the way small things always do. A child's rocking horse in the corner of what Bernard used as a storeroom, a small pair of leather boots on a shelf in the barn, sized for a toddler's foot. Clem mentioned once, briefly and with the careful brevity of someone who has learned what is allowed to be said, that the little one had not made it past his 3rd year. The little one. The son. Bernard had buried him in the east pasture and padlocked the gate and had not opened it in 5 years. Alberta had understood intellectually before the night of the supper conversation. She had assembled the pieces from what she could observe and had reached the logical conclusion. But knowing a thing in your mind and hearing it from the person who lived it were two entirely different experiences. She had asked him, that night at supper, with the simplicity that comes from trusting your instincts. She had not planned to ask. They had been eating. She had made a proper roast with potatoes and carrots from the root cellar, and the evening had been easy between them, easier than many evenings had been, and there had been something in the comfort of that ease that had made her say, gently, without preamble, "Bernard, why have you never opened the east pasture?" He had looked up from his plate. His amber eyes had met hers across the table, and she had expected him to deflect, to say it was complicated, to redirect the conversation with the practiced efficiency of a man who had deflected this question internally for 5 years. Instead, he had held her gaze for 3 full seconds, which was long enough to feel like a decision being made, and then he had said it. "I buried my son in that pasture." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the specific weight of confession, of the moment when a hidden thing enters the air for the first time and you are both uncertain what it will do there. "His name was James," Bernard continued, after a moment, looking down at his plate. "He was 3 years and 2 months old. He died in the February of 1877. He stopped. He picked up his coffee cup and set it down again without drinking from it. Ruth had already been gone for a year when James died. She had hemorrhaged badly after the birth and never recovered her strength. She lasted 14 months. His voice remained level in the way that a man's voice remains level when he has learned to hold emotion at a very long arm's length. When James got the fever, I sat with him for 6 days. The doctor came out twice from town. There was nothing. He stopped again. Alberta did not fill the silence. She had learned that some silences needed to be left alone. "He liked that pasture," Bernard said. "He was just starting to walk properly, and he had a particular way of running when he got into open space. Bernard paused, and something shifted in his face, and it was the most unguarded she had ever seen him. "He would run with his arms out to the sides for balance, I suppose, but it looked like he was about to fly, like a bird that was learning." He exhaled slowly. "I buried him there because it was his favorite place, and then I could not go back in." He looked up at her. 5 years. I kept telling myself I would open it in the spring. And then the spring would come and I would find I could not." Alberta's throat was tight. She did not trust herself to speak immediately, because what she felt in that moment was so large and so various: grief for this man, grief for the woman and the child she had never known, and something that was not grief at all but lived beside it, something that was more like the sensation of being given a key to a room you had been trying not to stare at, and she did not want to diminish any of it with the wrong words. "Thank you," she finally said, "for telling me." He looked at her with an expression she could not fully read, and then he nodded once briefly and returned to his supper. But something had changed in the room. The air had a different quality. She could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before it arrives. They washed the supper dishes together that night. They had fallen into this habit somewhere in the second week. Bernard would bring his plate and cup to the basin without being asked, and would dry whatever Alberta washed, and they would stand at the basin in companionable proximity. And it was in these moments that Alberta was most aware of how easy it was to be near him when he was not trying to manage his own distance. That night, standing side by side with the warm water between them and the oil lamp throwing its gold light over the kitchen walls, she was very aware of the fact that his shoulder was perhaps 4 inches from hers and that she did not want to move away. He handed her the last dried plate and said quietly, "I think it might be time to open it." She looked up at him. He was looking at the dark window above the basin, not at her. His jaw was set with the effort of something. "I think that might be right," she said carefully, "but only when you're ready." He turned to look at her then, and the directness of his gaze at close proximity startled her slightly, because for a fraction of a second there was something very raw in his expression before he assembled it into something more composed. "I do not know that I will ever feel ready," he admitted, "but there is a difference between ready and willing." She thought about that for a long time after she went to her room that night, lying in the dark with her hands clasped over her chest, listening to the vast and particular silence of the Texas hill country at night, the distant sound of cattle settling, the occasional call of a whippoorwill, the sound of the wind moving through the live oak trees that stood around the house. She thought about the difference between ready and willing, and she thought about Bernard Walker, and she thought about how the heart finds its way back to things, sometimes through the most unexpected of doors. The following morning was a Saturday, and Bernard did not ride out immediately after breakfast as he usually did on weekdays. He sat with his second cup of coffee for longer than usual, and Clem and Dorado had gone to town for supplies, and the ranch was quiet. Alberta was baking bread at the kitchen table when Bernard stood up from his chair and said, "I thought I would go open the east pasture today, if you wanted to come." She looked at him. He was looking at his coffee cup. "I would," she said simply. They walked out to the east pasture gate together on a Saturday morning in April of 1882, through grass that was damp with recent rain, and past the live oak trees and the cedar brush, with Patch trotting importantly ahead of them. Bernard had the key to the padlock in his shirt pocket. Alberta walked beside him and did not talk, because she understood that some things required quiet to be done properly. The padlock was stiff from years of disuse. Bernard's hands were steady, but she noticed the deliberate evenness of his breathing and recognized it as a form of discipline, the way a person breathes when they are keeping themselves in order by sheer will. The lock clicked open. He removed it and looped the chain back through the gate post and swung the gate open, and the long grass beyond bent in the morning breeze as if inclining toward them. He went in first. She followed at a small distance, to give him the space to go first, to have whatever moment he needed to have. The grass came nearly to her knee in places. Wildflowers had established themselves through the years of neglect, bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush, and something small and white that she did not know the name of. Patch was delighted by this terrain, and disappeared into the grass with his tail rotating like a small joyful flag. Bernard stopped near the center of the pasture, where a flat stone had been set into the ground. It was smooth river limestone, roughly the size of a large book, and on it someone, Bernard himself, she supposed, had chiseled the letters JW and 2 dates and nothing else. She stood beside him and looked at the stone. "Hello, James," Bernard said, very quietly, to the stone and to the air and to the open Texas sky above them. Alberta felt the grief rise in her chest on behalf of someone she had never known, and she did not hold it back entirely. She let it reach her eyes and sat with it honestly, the way you sit with a truth that needs to be acknowledged. They stayed in the east pasture for a long time that morning. Bernard talked about James haltingly at first, then more easily, the way speech comes when it has been dammed up for a long time and finally finds its outlet. He told her about the way James had laughed, which had been enormous and full-throated for such a small person. He told her about the time James had gotten into the chicken coop and emerged covered in feathers and indignant. He told her about the morning of James's last good day before the fever took hold, when they had ridden out to the east pasture together, Bernard with James in front of him on the saddle, and James had insisted on getting down and running in the grass with his arms out, for balance, for flying. Alberta listened to all of it. She asked questions when questions were right and held silence when silence was right. And somewhere in the course of that morning, she placed her hand over Bernard's where it rested on the top fence post, gently and without ceremony, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and neither of them remarked on it. They walked back to the house hand in hand, and she made lunch, and they ate it together in the kitchen with the windows open to the April air, and Bernard looked younger than he had looked any day since she arrived, as if something had been set down that had been very heavy. Over the following weeks, the thing between them developed with a particular quality that Alberta recognized as mutual care, expressed through proximity and attention to people who were being very careful with each other, because they both understood that the other one had been hurt before. Bernard began to find reasons to be near the house at midday. Alberta began to plan the supper conversations with the interest she had once directed toward curriculum. She wanted to have something to bring to the table that would interest him, some question or observation that would open things up rather than close them down. She was interested in everything about the ranch genuinely, not performatively. She had started riding out with Bernard on the days he was checking cattle or riding fence line, because she had asked him to teach her to ride, and he had, with patience and precision, starting with the gentlest horse in the barn, a roan mare named Bessie who was impeccably mannered. Alberta discovered that she took to riding with a natural ease that surprised both of them, and the expression on Bernard's face the first time she cantered Bessie across an open stretch of pasture without any apparent fear was one she catalogued and kept. Clem noticed. Clem was 52 and had been watching people with the quiet attention of a man who had observed a great deal of life and was no longer surprised by much of it, but who still found the right things quietly pleasing. He did not say anything directly, because he was not a man who said things directly when indirectly would serve. But he made a point of telling Alberta that the boss had laughed that morning at something Dorado said, and that it was the first time in a good while he had heard it, and he figured she had something to do with that. Dorado, who was 28 and had come up from Coahuila, Mexico, 10 years ago and whose full name was Ramon Dorado Garcia, was more direct. He caught Alberta alone near the barn one afternoon and said, with the cheerful bluntness of someone who has not yet learned why people don't say obvious things out loud, "Miss Prescott, the boss looks at you the way a man looks at a thing he cannot believe is real, but is afraid to touch in case it disappears." And then he had gone back to mending the harness he was working on as if he had not said anything at all. Alberta had carried that observation back to the kitchen and had sat with it for the rest of the afternoon. It was a warm evening in the middle of May when Bernard kissed her for the first time. They had been sitting on the porch after supper, as they had begun to do on the evenings when the weather permitted, in the two chairs that faced the open country to the south, and the sky had been doing the particular thing that the Texas sky does in May, where it goes through orange, and then violet, and then a deep blue that is almost audible in its intensity. They had been talking about very little, a letter she had written to her father in Cincinnati, the state of a fence line on the north boundary, and then they had been quiet together in the way that was comfortable, and Alberta had been watching a pair of mockingbirds conduct some kind of territorial negotiation in the cedar tree at the end of the porch when Bernard said her name. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with that amber gaze that she had stopped pretending she did not think about. He said, "I would like to say something, and I would ask you to hear me out before you respond." She nodded. "You came here to be a housekeeper," he said carefully. "And I want to say clearly that you are the finest housekeeper and the best companion and the most interesting person I have spoken to in a very long time, possibly ever. And I am aware that I am your employer, and that this places you in a position where you might feel unable to tell me directly if my attention is unwelcome." He paused. "So I want to ask you plainly, rather than assume, because you deserve to be asked plainly, whether my attention is welcome." Alberta looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Your attention is welcome, Bernard." He exhaled once sharply, like a man who had been holding his breath. And then he leaned forward and kissed her, gently and with obvious care, and she kissed him back with the same honest quality with which she approached everything completely and without reservation. When they separated, they looked at each other for a moment with the particular expression of two people who have just stepped off a cliff and discovered that the air is holding them. "Well," Alberta said. "Yes," Bernard said. Patch, who had been asleep at the end of the porch, lifted his head briefly, confirmed that nothing required his intervention, and went back to sleep. She should have been sleeping soundly that night, and she tried. But her mind kept running back over the evening with the persistent energy of someone replaying something wonderful, and she lay in the dark of her room and let herself acknowledge, with the unsparing honesty she tried to apply to her own inner life, that she was in a great deal of trouble in the most delightful way imaginable. She was in love with Bernard Walker. She was quite confident it had been building for weeks, and that the kissing on the porch was simply the moment where the thing she had been trying to view in peripheral vision had stepped directly in front of her and announced itself. What she did not know What she could not know yet was whether the feeling had roots in him that went as deep as hers, or whether she was the first piece of warmth he had reached toward out of a long cold, and whether warmth, if anything could have served as warmth, was all she was to him. She did not let herself spiral into that worry, because she was 30 years old and had learned enough about anxiety to know that it would show her exactly what she feared and call it the truth. Instead, she lay in the dark and listened to the ranch breathe around her, and reminded herself that she would know more when she knew more, and that the only thing to do was to keep being exactly who she was and let whatever was true find its way to the surface. What was true found its way to the surface over the next month with a momentum that was both faster and more natural than she had anticipated. Bernard courted her in the way that a serious man courts, not with grand gestures, because that was not who he was, but with 100 small and specific attentions that told her he was paying close attention to her specifically, not to a generalized idea of a woman. He built a proper bookshelf for her room without being asked, because he had noticed that she kept her books stacked on the floor for lack of anywhere else to put them. He sought out her opinion on the ranch's operations with a sincerity that made clear he was not asking to be polite. He genuinely wanted her perspective, and more than once acted on it. He remembered things she had said weeks earlier and brought them back into conversations with the precision of someone who had been genuinely listening. And he began, slowly and with obvious effort, to talk to her about the dark past, about Ruth, about James, about the years between their deaths and Alberta's arrival on the ranch. Years that, by his own admission, he had spent working himself nearly into the ground on purpose, because the only way he had found to manage the grief was to stay so physically exhausted that there was no room for it. He described this period of his life with a kind of honest self-assessment that Alberta found more revealing than any confession, the recognition that he had been using labor as an anesthetic, and that it had worked, and that it had also cost him, and that the cost was precisely the isolation she had found when she arrived. She told him things in return, things she had not told most people, because she had not had people in her life who had earned the telling. She told him about her father, and about the house in Cincinnati, and about the specific quality of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who do not see you. She told him about being let go from the school and the humiliation, and the rage she had felt that she had not been able to express anywhere, except in the long letter she had written and then burned, because there was no safe place to put it. She told him that she had answered his advertisement with an urgency she had dressed up as practicality, because the truth was that she had needed to go somewhere completely new, somewhere that had no idea who she was supposed to be, and start again. Bernard listened to all of this with the same attentive stillness with which he listened to everything that mattered. When she told him about the letter she had burned, he said, with a seriousness that made her want to laugh and hold him simultaneously, "I would have read that letter." She did laugh, and he smiled in the way he smiled, which was not wide but was deep and real and arrived at his eyes, and she understood in that moment that she was genuinely happy in a way she had not been in a very long time, possibly ever, and that the happiness had a specific person's name on it. The summer of 1882 deepened and grew hot in the way that Texas summers do, a full-bodied, comprehensive heat that pressed down on the land from morning to night and made even the creek run warm. Alberta adapted to it with the determination she brought to all practical challenges. She learned to start her heavy cooking in the early morning before the heat peaked, and to make cold suppers when the kitchen was unbearable in the evening. She learned the particular discipline of Texas summer water management, of watching the creek levels and the rain gauge, and communicating with Bernard about what the pastures needed. It was during a particularly long dry spell in July that the situation with Clyde Harmon arose, which was the most frightened Alberta had been since her arrival in Texas. Clyde Harmon was a rancher whose land bordered the Walker Ranch to the northwest. He was a broad, loud man with a reputation for boundary disputes that had preceded him in every conversation Alberta had overheard in the town of Sweetwater Creek on supply days. She had met him once at the general store and had formed the immediate and accurate impression that he was the kind of man who treated other people as obstacles or assets with no category in between. Harmon had been pressing Bernard for years. Clem explained the full history one afternoon while they were working together to sell him the northeast corner of the Walker Ranch, a parcel that contained the headwaters of Sweetwater Creek. Control of those headwaters would give Harmon a significant advantage in drought years because he could restrict the downstream flow to his own range and leave Bernard's cattle without reliable water. Bernard had refused to sell repeatedly and with increasing firmness. Harmon had, Clem said with deliberate understatement, taken the refusals personally. The confrontation came on a Wednesday in mid-July when Bernard and Alberta returned from a ride to find Harmon in the yard with two of his men, having apparently let himself onto the ranch property in Bernard's absence. He was standing near the well with his thumbs in his belt, and when Bernard dismounted he said, without preamble, that he had made his final offer for the northeast parcel and that Bernard should consider carefully what declining it would mean for his future operations. The implied threat was not subtle. Bernard's face went very still, which Alberta had learned meant that he was controlling something large. "Mr. Harmon," Bernard said, in a voice that was low and completely even, "you are on my land without invitation and making what sounds to me like a threat to a man who has never given you any reason to approach him this way. I would ask you to leave." Harmon's gaze slid to Alberta, who was still mounted on Bessie, and the assessment in that gaze was the kind that makes a woman's skin feel wrong. "Your housekeeper," he said to Bernard as if she were not present. "Miss Prescott is her name," Bernard said, still even, still low. "And she is not relevant to this conversation. Please leave my property, Mr. Harmon." Harmon left, but he left with the particular slowness of a man communicating that he was leaving by choice, and not because he had been made to, which was a kind of lie, and they all knew it. That night Bernard sat with Alberta on the porch long after supper, and he told her the full history of the dispute with Harmon, the legal attempts to contest the boundary survey, the pressure applied through Harmon's friends on the county commission, the two incidents of fence cutting on the northwest boundary that Bernard had not been able to prove were Harmon's doing, but which he was certain of nonetheless. He was telling her, Alberta understood, because he believed she had a right to understand the situation she was living in, because he was not the kind of man who would let someone share his roof and his table without understanding the risks attached to both. She listened carefully and then said, "What is the status of your survey documentation for the northeast parcel?" Bernard looked at her with the slightly startled expression he occasionally wore when she cut directly to the practical heart of something. "I have the original survey from 1869. My father had it done." "Is it filed with the county?" "It was. I have the copy." "Then Harmon's threat is hollow unless he is prepared to take you to court," she said. "And if he goes to court on a properly filed survey from 1869, he will lose, which means his only leverage is intimidation." She paused. "Has he succeeded in intimidating you?" Bernard was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "Then he has no leverage," Alberta said. "But you might consider writing to a lawyer in San Angelo and asking them to review the filing and confirm it is in order, not because you are afraid, but because documented preparation communicates clearly that you cannot be bluffed." Bernard looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had come to treasure, the expression of a man who had not expected this particular form of help from this particular direction, and was recalibrating accordingly. "I will do that," he said. The letter to the lawyer was written the following day, by Alberta on Bernard's behalf, because Bernard had asked her to draft it, and she had done so in plain and unambiguous language that the lawyer in San Angelo, when he wrote back 3 weeks later, described as admirably clear. The survey was confirmed in order. The lawyer noted that any challenge to it would face significant difficulty. Bernard had the letter put in the lockbox in his study, and the matter with Harmon settled into a cold peace that, while not comfortable, was at least bounded and manageable. The East Pasture had been open now for several months, and something had changed in the ranch's atmosphere that Alberta could not quite name except to say that the place felt more inhabited. Not by ghosts, the opposite of that actually. She thought of it sometimes as a held breath finally released, a pressure equalized. Bernard rode through the East Pasture regularly now, and sometimes he stopped at the flat stone, and sometimes she was with him when he did, and sometimes she was not. She had understood without being told that grief does not end when you open the gate. It simply becomes something you live alongside rather than something you barricade yourself from, and that this was, in its way, an enormous improvement. She had written to her father in Cincinnati 3 times since arriving at the ranch. Her father had written back twice letters that were factual and cool, describing the state of his business and the weather, not asking after her well-being. She had read these letters with the clarity of someone who has stepped far enough back from a situation to see it plain, and she had written back with the same calm, because she had decided long ago that her father's limitations were not her failure. She mentioned this to Bernard one evening, the particular quality of her relationship with her father, and Bernard listened with the attention he always gave to things she said about herself. And then he said, "I think people who have grown up without the warmth they deserved become very good at generating their own when they get the chance." He looked at her across the table. "You are evidence of that." She had needed a moment before she could respond to that, because it was said with such straightforward sincerity that it bypassed all her practiced composure and landed somewhere very direct. "Thank you," she said. And then, because she had decided weeks ago that she was not going to let fear of being wrong prevent her from being honest when the moment was right, she said, "Bernard, I think you should know that I love you." The kitchen was very quiet. The lamp burned steadily. Outside, a night bird called once and was silent. Bernard put down his coffee cup with great care and looked at her for a long moment that she did not try to fill. "Alberta," he said. His voice had a particular roughness to it that she had not heard before. "I have been trying to work out how to say the same thing to you for about 3 weeks." She let out a breath that was also half a laugh. And I find I do not have a method that seems adequate," he said. "So I will simply say it plainly. I love you. I have loved you. I think I began to love you when you organized my accounts ledger and informed me that my filing system was, in your exact words, an archaeological site waiting for excavation." He paused. "That was the day I understood that you were not at all what I expected and that this was entirely to my benefit." Alberta laughed, fully this time. And then she stood up from her side of the table and walked around to his side, and Bernard stood, and they were very close together in the lamplit kitchen of the Walker Ranch. And she put her hands on his chest, and he put his arms around her, and held her in the way that has no particular technique, simply the way a person holds onto something they intend to keep. They were married in September of 1882, in the town of Sweetwater Creek, in the small Methodist church that the town had completed the previous year. It was a simple ceremony, because both of them preferred simplicity to display, but it was attended by a surprising number of people because Bernard Walker had been in this country for his entire life and had done right by his neighbors in every practical way, even during the years when he had retreated from most social connection, and people remembered that. Clem and Dorado stood up for the groom. The minister's wife played the organ. Alberta wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had ordered from a dry goods catalog in San Angelo, and that had arrived 2 weeks before the ceremony and fit her nearly perfectly, requiring only minor adjustment at the waist. She walked up the aisle of the small church toward Bernard, who was standing at the front in his good coat with his hair combed, and his amber eyes fixed on her with an expression of such open and undisguised feeling that she felt it in her sternum, and she thought, This is where the story was going all along, and it only looked complicated from inside it. They said their vows to each other with the complete attention of two people who have thought carefully about what they are promising. And when Bernard took her hands, they were steady, both of them, steady and warm. The reception was held in the church hall afterward, with food contributed by half the town, because that is what small communities do when they have been waiting a long time for something good to happen to one of their own. Clem ate an amount that suggested he had been preparing for the occasion all week. Dorado danced with every willing woman in the room with the uninhibited energy of someone who believed dancing was a form of courtesy. Mrs. Hargrove from the general store told Alberta that the town had been worried about Bernard Walker for years, and that they were all collectively relieved and grateful, and said this with a sincerity that Alberta found both touching and slightly overwhelming. Bernard and Alberta left the church hall in the early evening and drove home to the ranch in the buckboard wagon under a sky that was becoming spectacular with autumn stars, and they were quiet together in the way that was comfortable and complete. When they arrived back at the ranch, Bernard helped her down from the wagon and kept hold of her hand, and they stood for a moment in the yard under the stars with the October air cool on their faces and the sound of the cattle settling for the night and Patch circling them with proprietary satisfaction. "Mrs. Walker," Bernard said. He was looking at the stars, but she could see the expression on his face in the starlight. "Mr. Walker," she replied. He looked down at her. He kissed her there in the yard under the stars, and the kiss was different from the first one on the porch, not tentative, not asking a question. It was the kiss of a man who had his answer and intended to keep it. The first winter of their marriage was cold by Texas standards, with genuine freezing temperatures through January and February, and a rare and remarkable snowfall in late January that blanketed the hill country overnight and transformed the ranch into a landscape so alien and beautiful that Alberta stood on the porch in her coat in the early morning and simply stared at it. Bernard came to stand beside her with 2 cups of coffee, and they watched the sun come up over the snow-covered country together, and she thought there were worse ways to begin a life. She had taken full ownership of the ranch accounts and management of the household operations, and Bernard had yielded this ground to her, with a lack of resistance that told her he had always known the organization required help, and was simply relieved the help had arrived. She introduced a proper breeding record for the cattle that allowed Bernard to track lineage and production in ways he had previously managed only by memory. She established a relationship with the merchant bank in San Angelo for proper land and operations financing that freed Bernard from the annual anxiety of the dry months when cash was tight. She wrote every letter that needed writing and handled every business correspondence. And Bernard did not simply accept this help, he was interested in how she thought, consistently. And their evenings frequently involved long conversations about the decisions they were making together as partners in the full meaning of the word. The news that Alberta was expecting their first child came in the spring of 1883, confirmed by Dr. Hawkins from Sweetwater Creek on a Tuesday in April. She told Bernard that evening after supper, standing in the kitchen, without any particular dramatic staging, because she had found that the most significant things could be said plainly. The expression on Bernard's face was one she had never seen before and would never forget. It moved through surprise into something that was joy and terror simultaneously, and she watched him contain both and then watched him let the joy win, which took perhaps 4 seconds, and which she thought was one of the most honest things she had ever seen a person do. He crossed the kitchen and held her with the same wordless completeness as before, and she felt his heart beating against her cheek, fast and steady. "Are you frightened?" she asked against his chest, because the dark past was the dark past and it had happened and she was not going to pretend it had not. "Yes," he said immediately. "And I intend to be frightened all the way through and on the other side, and it will not change anything." She leaned back to look at him. "It will be all right," she said. She said it not to reassure him away from his fear, but because she genuinely believed it, which was different. "I know," he said. The pregnancy proceeded without significant complication, which Dr. Hawkins monitored with the diligence Alberta demanded from him at every appointment, because she was not a woman who accepted vague reassurances when specific information was available. She remained active through most of the pregnancy, adapting her work on the ranch progressively as her body required, and Bernard was attentive in the way that he was attentive to everything important practically and without theatrics, making sure she was not overexerting herself without making her feel that she was being managed. In late November of 1883, Alberta went into labor on a cold, gray morning with a north wind pressing against the house and the fire built high in the kitchen stove. Bernard had gone for Dr. Hawkins at first light, riding hard, and Clem had sat in the kitchen through the morning with his hat in his hands, and a manner suggesting he would have prayed if he had known how. Dorado had gone to inspect the furthest fence line, which everyone understood was his way of managing the waiting, and come back 4 hours later to find the news already made. The child was a boy. Bernard was in the room when the baby was born, because Alberta had asked him to be, and because he had not hesitated for a moment. He held his son for the first time with hands that had spent 36 years learning to be steady in every kind of condition, and they were steady now, but barely, and Alberta watched his face from where she was lying and saw everything she needed to see. They named the boy Thomas James Walker, for the grandfather Bernard had loved and for the brother Thomas would never know. The James was for the East Pasture and for the flat stone, and for the boy who had run with his arms out like a bird learning to fly. And Bernard had suggested it, and Alberta had agreed immediately, because she understood what it meant to carry the people you loved into the next thing rather than leaving them behind. Thomas James Walker was a child of loud and comprehensive opinions from his first days, which both his parents found enormously entertaining. He developed quickly, with the particular combination of physical boldness and intellectual curiosity that Alberta recognized with startled delight as a version of herself, tempered with Bernard's steadiness. He began walking at 11 months, a fact that occupied Bernard's entire emotional attention for approximately 2 weeks, because a walking child is a child who can get into things. He was a child who got into things. The second year of Thomas's life was also the year that Clyde Harmon finally pushed too far. The fence cutting on the northwest boundary had continued sporadically throughout 1883 and into 1884, and Bernard had documented each incident carefully with dates and sketches, and the testimony of Clem and Dorado. In the spring of 1884, 3 of Bernard's cattle were found dead near the northwest boundary, with circumstances that did not look like natural death. Bernard rode to town and spoke with the county sheriff, a methodical man named Fletcher who had always been fair to Bernard, but who was also aware that Harmon was a significant landowner in the county. Alberta drafted the formal complaint to the county sheriff's office herself, in the clearest possible language, with the full incident documentation attached. She also wrote a letter to the lawyer in San Angelo, who advised them that the cumulative evidence was now sufficient to support a civil claim for damages and property destruction. She asked Bernard whether he wanted to pursue it. "Yes," he said, without hesitation. The legal proceeding took 4 months and was uncomfortable throughout, requiring multiple trips to San Angelo and a degree of public attention that neither of them found pleasant. Harmon hired an attorney who was aggressive and skilled at intimidation, and the attorney attempted to depict Bernard as a difficult and litigious neighbor who had manufactured grievances. Alberta sat through every proceeding with her face composed and her hands still in her lap, and when the attorney attempted on one occasion to suggest that her correspondence on Bernard's behalf indicated that Bernard was being manipulated by an outside interest, meaning herself, she looked at the attorney with an expression so entirely calm and so entirely devastating that Dorado, who had accompanied them to San Angelo for that proceeding, later described it as the most effective thing he had ever seen done without any weapons. The court found in Bernard's favor in October of 1884. Harmon was ordered to pay damages and to cease all interference with the Walker Ranch boundary. Harmon paid the damages with the furious compliance of a man who has lost and knows it, and the fence cutting stopped immediately and permanently. Bernard and Alberta drove home from San Angelo after the verdict with Thomas asleep between them in the wagon seat, his small head against Alberta's arm. The country around them was in full autumn color, the sumac gone red, the cottonwoods yellow, the sky the particular deep blue of October in Texas. Bernard was quiet in the way he was quiet when he was genuinely satisfied with something. "You were magnificent," he said at some point in the drive. "The documentation was magnificent," she said. "I merely organized it." "You organized it, you wrote the complaint, you prepared the evidence, you attended every proceeding, and you intimidated Harmon's attorney into losing his train of thought at least twice," Bernard said. "Alberta, you were magnificent." She looked at him. He was watching the road ahead with the hint of that deep, real smile at the corner of his mouth. "We were," she said. He reached over Thomas's sleeping head and found her hand and held it for the rest of the drive home. The ranch flourished in the years that followed with the particular quality of flourishing that comes not from luck, but from two people who are genuinely good at complementing each other's capabilities, and who believe in the work they are doing together. Bernard's instincts with the cattle and the land were the instincts of someone who had grown up in this specific place and understood it in his bones. When to move the herd, where the grass would hold through a dry summer, which calves would thrive and which would need intervention. Alberta's understanding of the financial and organizational side of the operation grew steadily deeper, and her relationship with the San Angelo Bank and with the network of buyers in the cattle markets became one of the ranch's significant operational assets. She hired a woman named Perla Domings from town to help in the house when Thomas was 18 months old, both because the work required more hands, and because she had observed that Clem and Perla looked at each other with the careful, slightly terrified attention of two people managing a significant feeling, which she found deeply charming and declined to interfere with, allowing time and proximity to do what they reliably do. Clem and Perla were married in the spring of 1885 in the same Methodist church where Alberta and Bernard had married, and Alberta considered this one of the more satisfying developments in the history of the Walker Ranch, and said so to Bernard with the mild insufferability of someone who is almost always right about people. Thomas grew into a boy of tremendous energy and genuine sweetness, with his mother's quickness and his father's steadiness, and a stubbornness that both his parents privately recognized as shared inheritance. He was fascinated by the East Pasture from his earliest understanding of it. He had visited the flat stone with both his parents many times, and he understood, with the matter-of-fact grasp of children who are told the truth simply and without excessive drama, that James had been his father's son before Thomas was born, and that the East Pasture was a special place for that reason. One afternoon when Thomas was 4, Alberta found him sitting cross-legged in front of the flat stone in the East Pasture in the manner of someone conducting a serious private conversation. She stopped at a distance and watched for a moment without interrupting. Thomas appeared to be telling James about something that had happened with the chickens in considerable detail and with his hands involved in the telling. She went back to the house without calling him because some conversations are private and deserve to be. She told Bernard that evening quietly after Thomas was asleep. Bernard was quiet for a moment and then he said, "He has your quality of not being afraid of important things." She thought about that. "He has yours," she said. Bernard looked at her across the kitchen table. The lamp was burning between them, the same as it had been on the night he told her about the East Pasture, about James, about the 5 years he had kept the gate locked. The kitchen was the same kitchen, and the lamp threw the same gold light, but everything else was different. the accounts ledger on the shelf now neatly maintained, the books on the shelf Bernard had built her, the small wooden horse Thomas had left on the table because he took it everywhere and left it everywhere. Perla's cooking things organized alongside Alberta's in the cupboard. The photographs Bernard had sent for from San Angelo, and that hung on the wall, one from their wedding day, one from Thomas's first Christmas. "I was thinking about something," Alberta said into the comfortable quiet. "Tell me," Bernard said. "I would like to plant something in the east pasture," she said carefully. "If you agree, not close to the stone, just at the perimeter, a line of trees, peach trees. I was thinking, there is a nursery in San Angelo that carries them." Bernard was quiet for a moment. "Peach trees," he said. "They are long-lived," Alberta said, "and they bloom in the spring, and in a good year they give fruit." She looked at him. "I thought James might have liked peach trees." Bernard looked at her for a long moment. "He would have climbed them," he said, "the moment they were tall enough." "Thomas will climb them," she said. Something crossed Bernard's face that was not grief and was not happiness, but was something that held both inside it without contradiction, the way certain moments do when you have lived long enough and loved enough to understand that sorrow and joy are not opposites. They are simultaneous. They are both true at once. "Yes," he said, "let us plant peach trees." She ordered them from San Angelo in the late winter of 1886. They arrived as slender bare-root whips, 12 of them, and she and Bernard and Thomas planted them on a Saturday morning along the east fence of the east pasture, with Thomas working very seriously with a small shovel that Bernard had fashioned for him, placing each tree with the ceremony of someone who understood he was doing something that mattered. When the last tree was in the ground and watered, and the Saturday morning had gone toward noon, Thomas put his small shovel over his shoulder and regarded the line of young trees with visible satisfaction. "James will like them," he announced with certainty, and then turned and walked back toward the house to inform Perla that he was hungry, leaving his parents standing in the spring sunshine looking at 12 bare-root whips that would, in time, be trees. Alberta found Bernard's hand. He held hers as he always did, with the complete and reliable warmth that she had come to understand was his particular language, the language of a man who said the most important things not with words but with the constancy of his presence, the quality of his attention, the fact that he was always there. "Thank you," he said. She looked up at him. "For what specifically?" "For asking why," he said. She thought about that evening 3.5 years ago, the supper table, the lamp between them, the simple question she had asked that had opened everything. She thought about the locked gate and the tall grass and the flat stone and the 5 years of silence that had ended because she had asked a question and he had chosen to answer it. "Thank you for telling me," she said. He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles in the grave, unhurried way he had of doing things, like a man who has learned that time is worth taking. The peach trees bloomed the following spring in clouds of pale pink that were visible from the kitchen window. Thomas declared this the best thing that had happened in recent memory, which was high praise from a child whose life contained a great many things competing for the distinction. Bernard stood at the kitchen window one morning and watched the bloom in the east pasture without saying anything, and then he went out to his morning work, and when he came back for breakfast, he looked rested in a way that Alberta had learned to recognize, the particular rest of someone who has put something down and found that the world did not end when they did. She found out she was expecting their second child in the autumn of 1887, a fact she confirmed with Dr. Hawkins and reported to Bernard that evening in the same straightforward way as before, standing in the kitchen after supper. Bernard's response was identical in structure and different in texture, the same surprise, the same simultaneous joy and fear, but the fear was shorter this time, the joy arriving faster because he had the evidence of his own experience now, the knowledge that he had done this before and that it had gone well, that good things happened and were allowed to stay. He held her the same way. His heart beat the same. "Another Thomas," he said into her hair. "Or not," she said. The second child, born in May of 1888, was a girl. She arrived with the same comprehensive opinions as her brother, expressed loudly and immediately, and she had her father's amber eyes and her mother's dark hair, and a look about her from the very first hours of her life that suggested she would be forming strong positions about things at the earliest possible opportunity. They named her Ruth, for Bernard's first wife. This had been Alberta's suggestion, made with deliberate care, because she understood that the name was a gift rather than a burden, that naming the daughter Ruth was a way of saying that love does not have to be divided, that a second love does not erase a first, that the people we have lost can be honored in the living without the living being diminished by the comparison. Bernard had been very quiet when she suggested it, and then had said she would have been glad, and that was all that needed to be said. Baby Ruth Walker was as different from Thomas as two people sharing blood could be. Where Thomas was large and loud and perpetually in motion, Ruth was observant and precise and took her time about things. She watched everything with those amber eyes before she committed to an action, and once she committed she was implacable. She was walking at 9 months, which startled everyone, and speaking in full sentences by 14 months, which startled no one who had observed those amber eyes at work. Thomas adored his sister with the passionate certainty of a 4-year-old who has decided on something. He incorporated her into his existence as a matter of course, including her in conversations with the flat stone in the east pasture, explaining the chickens to her at close range, and attempting to teach her to throw a ball at an age when her hand-eye coordination was not quite ready for the lesson, which she bore with the patient dignity of someone who knew her time was coming. Clem and Perla had their own child in 1889, a boy they named Eduardo, who arrived in the spring, and who Thomas immediately adopted as a secondary project, because one child to instruct was not enough for Thomas Walker's organizational ambitions. The bunkhouse had evolved over the years into a proper small cottage that Bernard had improved progressively, because Clem had given 11 years of honest work and deserved to live somewhere that befitted a man with a family. Perla and Alberta had become close in the way that women become close when they are doing difficult things together over years, and the ranch felt, on its best days, like something larger than a business, like a community of people who had found each other somewhat accidentally and decided to stay. Dorado, who had been talking about eventually going back to Coahuila for the first several years of his employment, and had been saying less and less about it as the years passed, had fallen quietly and thoroughly in love with the sister of a woman who ran the millinery in Sweetwater Creek. Her name was Consuela Ruiz, and she was 24 and funny, and had no patience for pretension, which meant she and Dorado were ideally matched. They married in 1889, and Dorado put the final conversation about returning to Coahuila permanently to rest without anyone needing to mention it. The Walker Ranch entered the decade of the 1890s with good pastures, a growing herd, sound finances, peach trees in the east pasture bearing their first real harvest, and a household that Alberta looked around at sometimes in the evenings with a feeling she could not fully articulate. Not just happiness, though it was that, but something more specific. Something that felt like arriving, like having been in transit for a long time without knowing it, and then stepping off a train into the right place at last. Thomas was 8 when the peach trees gave their first proper harvest, and he climbed all 12 of them on that first harvesting day, with an athleticism that made his father observe that James had apparently gotten his wish by proxy, which made Alberta laugh and reach for his hand at the kitchen table. Ruth was 4 and stood at the base of each tree with her arms extended, ready to catch anything Thomas threw down, with an expression of serious logistical competence that was so precisely her mother's face that Bernard had to look away to compose himself. They made preserves, that year 8 jars of peach preserves that Alberta put up in the root cellar with the careful labeling she applied to everything, and Bernard opened a jar the following February on a cold morning when the north wind was pressing at the house, and spread the preserves on the morning biscuits, and the kitchen smelled of summer in the middle of winter, and both children ate their biscuits with the solemn appreciation of people who understood, in some wordless way, that something good had been made here. Alberta sat across the breakfast table on that February morning of 1894 and looked at the people around it, Bernard with his coffee, and the morning's first evidence of that deep, real smile. Thomas, who was 9 and already showing signs of the person he would be, someone large-hearted and capable and fully himself. Ruth, who was 5 and eating her biscuit with precise, methodical happiness, and felt the particular quality of gratitude that only arrives when you know what the alternative was, when you remember the rented room and the gray snow against the window, and the advertisement in the newspaper that might have been so many other things and was instead this. She picked up her coffee cup. She looked at Bernard. He was looking at her already, the way he was frequently looking at her when she looked up, with the amber eyes and the expression that was not theatrical but was simply true, the expression of a man who has found the thing and knows it and is grateful every day. "I was thinking," she said. "Tell me," he said, because he always said that. "The North Meadow," she said. "The one by the creek. I was thinking we might put in an orchard there as well. Apple trees. They would do well in that soil, I think, and the water access is good." Bernard considered this. "Thomas would approve," he said. "Thomas will climb them before they have finished being planted," Alberta said. Bernard smiled. "That's a fair projection." He looked at his coffee cup and then back at her. "Apple trees in the North Meadow," he said. "I think that is a fine idea." She nodded. She drank her coffee. Across the table, Thomas had finished his biscuit and was now outlining to Ruth a complicated plan involving the top pasture that Ruth was listening to with the skeptical patience of someone mentally identifying the flaws before commenting on them. The ranch moved around them in its rhythms. The cattle in the far pastures, the creek running clear and steady with the winter rains, the peach trees dormant and waiting in the east pasture beside the flat stone with JW on it, and the 2 dates. Outside, Clem and Dorado were already at the morning work, because the work of a ranch does not wait, which is both its difficulty and its grace. Alberta set down her coffee cup and stood to begin clearing the breakfast things, and Bernard rose to help her as he always did, carrying his plate and cup to the basin, and taking up the drying cloth without being asked, because in 11 years of marriage these habits had been made permanent, pressed into the daily fabric so thoroughly that they required no more thought than breathing. They stood at the basin in the winter morning light, washing and drying shoulder to shoulder, with the children's voices behind them and the good smell of the kitchen around them. And Bernard said, quietly, with the directness he always brought to important things, "Alberta." She glanced at him. He was looking at the window above the basin, the kitchen window that looked east, toward the east pasture where the peach trees stood waiting for spring. "I am glad you asked," he said. She knew what he meant. She had always known, from the moment he had answered her, from the moment he had chosen to take the question she offered him and answer it fully, to give her the locked place, and the 5 years of silence and the flat stone and the boy who had run with his arms out like a bird learning to fly. She had known what it cost him and what it built between them and where it led, and it had led here, to this kitchen and this morning and this life. "I am glad you told me," she said. He put down his drying cloth and turned to her, and she turned to him, and he kissed her in the kitchen on a February morning in 1894, the way he kissed her, with complete attention and without hurry, like a man who intends to still be doing this in 30 years and has no reason to rush. From the table, Ruth said with 4-year-old pragmatism, "They are doing that again." Thomas said with 9-year-old authority, "They do that a lot. It means they like each other." Bernard and Alberta separated, and she looked at him with laughter in her eyes, and he looked at her with laughter in his, and the kitchen held all of them, the children at the table, the winter light coming through the windows, the preserves in the root cellar made from the trees they had planted together. The years ahead full of apple orchards and new calves and supper table conversations, and cold mornings and warm summers, and all the ordinary extraordinary business of a life, built by two people who had found each other somewhere in the middle of their respective stories, and had decided, with the best judgment either of them had ever exercised, to continue from that point together. The peach trees would bloom again in the spring, the east pasture gate would stay open, and the Walker Ranch would go on, season by season, year by year, the way things go on when they are rooted in real ground and tended by people who understand what they have. Alberta Prescott Walker stood at the kitchen basin on a February morning and looked at her husband and her children and her life, and she knew, with the absolute clarity that sometimes visits a person when they are exactly where they are supposed to be, doing exactly what they are supposed to be doing, with exactly the people they were meant to find, that this was it. This was the thing. This was the thing worth everything it had cost to get here. And she held it, and it held her, and the fire in the kitchen stove burned warm and steady, and outside the east pasture waited for spring.